I always believed in the sanctity of life. As a surgeon, I dedicated my career to saving it, even when it teetered on the edge of the impossible. When the opportunity arose to perform the first head transplant, I knew this was my moment, the chance to etch my name into the annals of medical history. But I never imagined that it would be etched in blood. The patient, Jonathan Miles, was a young man in his 30s, paralyzed from the neck down after a devastating car accident. His body had failed him, but his mind was sharp, desperate for a second chance. The donor was an unfortunate victim of a motorcycle crash, brain dead, but with a perfectly healthy body. It was a match too perfect to ignore. The procedure was meticulously planned over months. Every nerve, every blood vessel, every muscle fiber had to be aligned with surgical precision. My team and I rehearsed the operation dozens of times, honing our skills on cadavers and virtual models until we could perform it in our sleep. But surgery is never predictable. Not on this scale. The day of the operation arrived. The room was cold, sterile, but my hands were steady. We began at dawn, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were ready to complete the final stage, attaching the head to the new body. The moment the last suture was placed, and the machines began to pump life into Jonathan's new body, something felt off. It was as though the air in the room thickened, pressing down on us. But we ignored it, focusing on the monitors, waiting for a sign of life. His eyelids fluttered open. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. We had done it. Jonathan Miles was the first human to survive a full head transplant. But then he screamed. It wasn't the scream of someone in pain. It was primal, a sound that didn't belong in this world. His body convulsed, tearing at the restraints we had placed for his safety. His eyes, they weren't his. They were wild, feral, reflecting a torment I couldn't begin to understand. "We need to sedate him," one of the nurses shouted. But I was frozen, staring at the creature on the table. Creature. That's the only word that fit. Jonathan's new body twisted unnaturally, as if it didn't belong to him. His limbs moved with a will of their own, fighting against the very mind they were now supposed to obey. "We've got to stop this." The anesthesiologist rushed forward, syringe in hand, but before she could administer the sedative, Jonathan's, or was it someone else's, hand shot out, grasping her wrist with an inhuman strength. The syringe clattered to the floor as she gasped, her face turning pale. His grip was like a vice, crushing bone and flesh as though they were nothing. I tried to intervene, but the sight of his face, no longer Jonathan's, no longer human, paralyzed me with fear. "Doctor!" The cry snapped me out of my stupor, and I rushed forward, grabbing the sedative from the floor. My hands shook as I plunged it into his arm, praying it would take effect before more damage was done. But the moment the drug entered his bloodstream, he went still, too still. The machine screamed as his heart flatlined, and the grip on the nurse's wrist loosened, her mangled hand slipping free. We tried to revive him, but it was futile. Jonathan, or whatever he had become, was gone. But as we worked, I felt a cold breath on my neck, a whisper of air that didn't belong. And then I saw it. Reflected in the polished surface of the operating lights was a figure, standing over Jonathan's lifeless body. It wasn't anyone in the room. It wasn't anyone I recognized. But it was watching me, its face twisted into a smile that was all wrong. When I looked back down, Jonathan's eyes were open again. But they weren't his. They never had been. That night, I burned the files, destroyed every piece of evidence of what we had done. But the nightmares remained. I see his face every time I close my eyes, hear that scream echoing in the darkness. I thought I was saving a life, but I had unleashed something else entirely. And now, it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. Because I know, deep down, that when I looked into that twisted smile, it wasn't a ghost or a hallucination. It was the future. Days turned into weeks, but the unease in the hospital never dissipated. Nurses whispered about hearing voices in the operating room, voices that weren't there. Several staff members resigned, citing an overwhelming sense of dread that followed them home. But for me, the nightmare was just beginning. I started seeing things. shadows moving just out of sight, reflections in mirrors that didn't match my own movements. It was as if the world around me was unraveling, one thread at a time. But the worst of it was Jonathan, or what was left of him. The hospital insisted on a thorough investigation after his death. The media frenzy was merciless, demanding answers I couldn't give. But what haunted me wasn't the scrutiny. It was the fact that Jonathan's body was never buried. I found out one night, long after the investigation had concluded. I had stayed late, trying to catch up on paperwork that had piled up during the chaos. As I walked through the deserted hallways, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows, I heard something, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the hum of the air conditioning. But as I approached the morgue, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from inside. My heart pounded as I opened the door. The room was cold, and the smell of formaldehyde hung heavy in the air. But the whispering, it was unmistakable, and it was coming from one of the drawers. Jonathan's drawer. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. With trembling hands, I pulled open the drawer. Jonathan's body lay there, covered by a white sheet, but the moment I saw him, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. I reached out, hesitating before pulling the sheet back. His face was pale, lifeless, but his eyes, they were wide open, staring straight at me. They weren't the eyes I remembered. They were darker, emptier, as if something had hollowed them out and left behind nothing but void. And then he moved. His hand, cold as ice, reached out and grasped my wrist, just as he had done to the nurse. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, and his lips moved, forming words that sent a chill down my spine. Not done. The words were barely a whisper, but they echoed in my mind, reverberating through every bone in my body. His grip tightened, pulling me closer, his breath cold against my skin. Finish what you started. I wrenched my hand free, stumbling back, nearly falling to the floor. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second, and when they came back on, Jonathan's hand was back on his chest. His eyes closed as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. Jonathan wasn't gone. Not completely. Something had tethered him to this world. Something that refused to let him rest. And it was my fault. I ran from the morgue that night, leaving the hospital without looking back. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each passing day, filling my head with thoughts that weren't my own. They wanted me to go back, to finish what I had started. But what did that mean? What was left to finish? Desperate for answers, I began researching everything I could about the procedure, about head transplants, about the thin line between life and death. The more I learned, the more I realized how little we understood. We had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and now the consequences were unraveling before me. But the final piece of the puzzle didn't fall into place until I visited Jonathan's family. His wife, Sarah, was devastated by his death, but there was something else in her eyes, something she was holding back. When I pressed her, she finally broke down, confessing something I hadn't expected. Jonathan had been obsessed with the idea of immortality. He had always feared death, and when the accident happened, that fear only grew stronger. He had confided in her, expressing his willingness to do anything to live, no matter the cost. And when the opportunity for the transplant arose, he saw it as his chance to cheat death, to keep living no matter what. But there was a price to be paid. Jonathan had been researching ancient texts, obscure rituals that spoke of transferring the soul, of binding it to something other than the body. I didn't believe in such things, not really, but after what I had seen, I couldn't dismiss it either. What if Jonathan had found a way to bind his soul to the new body, but something had gone wrong? What if he had been trying to tell me that he wasn't finished, that he was trapped between life and death, unable to move on? There was only one way to find out. I returned to the hospital in the dead of night, sneaking into the morgue with a sense of dread that threatened to overwhelm me. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of facing Jonathan again filled me with terror. But this time, I wasn't going to run. I stood over his body, the cold of the morgue seeping into my bones, and I began to speak. I spoke of life, of death, of the line we had crossed, and I begged him to let go, to move on. But as I spoke, the room grew colder, the lights flickering once again. And then I saw it, the figure from before, standing at the edge of the room, watching me with those twisted eyes, that cruel smile. It wasn't Jonathan. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. Finish what you started. The voice echoed around me, and I realized with horror what it meant. Jonathan wasn't the only one who had been brought back. When we had performed the transplant, we had opened a door that should have remained closed. And now something had come through. I looked down at Jonathan's body, his eyes open once more. But this time there was no life in them, no soul. Whatever had been him was gone. And in its place was something else, something that shouldn't exist. And then it hit me. The only way to finish this was to destroy what we had created, to close the door we had opened. But it was too late. The thing that had crossed over wasn't going to let that happen. Before I could react, the figure moved, faster than anything I had ever seen, and in an instant, it was upon me. Cold hands gripped my throat, squeezing the life out of me as I struggled to break free. But as the darkness closed in, I realized the truth. I had become part of the experiment, part of the twisted future that Jonathan had tried to create. And now there was no escape. As I took my final breath, the last thing I saw was Jonathan's twisted smile, his empty eyes staring into mine, and I knew that I had failed. The mirror of life had shattered, and what lay on the other side was something far worse than death.